James McGann is director of the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, the program released its 10th annual Global Go-To Think Tank Index, a ranking of more than 7,000 think tanks. Jim, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
This must be like Christmas morning for you. All the anticipation and all the months of work, and then here is the day.
The anticipation is like a couple days earlier. For all of the think tanks around the world today, it is like Christmas morning or a holiday, and expecting that, and some maybe not so bright a holiday, depending on where they are on the rankings.
I'm not going to assume that people all share a universal definition of what a think tank is. So I want to ask you how you define a think tank.
I mean, obviously, spent a lot of time on this. It's public policy, research, analysis, and engagement institutions that do research on domestic and international issues to inform public decision making for both policymakers and the public.
Is there a preponderance of think tanks that are either ideologically or partisanly aligned, or do they tend to be more in the nonpartisan sphere?
I think overall they tend to be nonpartisan, but it is, as was reflected in today's panel here at the Wilson Center, a pretty diverse group. And certainly in the United States, I'm frequently, would say that virtually every political, philosophical orientation toward a particular policy problem is represented. That is not the case in every country around the world. And some would say maybe that the U.S. is a little too cacophonous in terms of all of the noise, but I think that the diversity that exists in the U.S. Think tank ecology is a positive thing, because all perspectives are considered, and there's an institution to represent various constituencies and views on policy.
Is it the U.S. has the most think tanks of any one single country? Is that
correct? Is correct. That is correct.
Is it a growth industry in the U.S. or globally?
Certainly globally, and I think that I would describe it that there's the creation, new institutions in the U.S. continue to be created, but the greatest growth are in other regions of the world. Certainly in Asia, there's explosive growth, and there's as the countries grow in stature, their economies grow, and the need for sound analysis. There has been explosive growth throughout Asia, in India, in China, in Korea, etc.
Does it also serve to further influence, national influence? I think of, say, China, where it seems to be a growth industry in all categories. This is Chinese think tanks can promote Chinese thinking about issues.
Yes, certainly. I mean, and Xi Jinping specifically has mentioned think tanks more than any other organization since coming to power as an instrument of advancing reform and modernization in China. He is also acutely aware and has mobilized an unprecedented amount of money to influence global institutions and countries around the world.
So take us back 10 years. Why did you decide to take this project on?
Well, it actually all grew out of the Hewlett Foundation. William and Flora Hewlett Foundation was about to launch, in conjunction with the Gates Foundation, a $175 million investment in think tanks in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And they came to me with the question, they wanted to know in process, and post, how will we know that we've had any impact on these countries and institutions that we're supporting? And asked me to sort of identify two things. One, what were the countries in those regions in terms of both in the low end, middle, and upper end in terms of institutions where they might target their investment, but also identify a set of criteria that they might use for in process, and post evaluation. And as a part of that, I did an extensive literature review, interviewed over 100 experts, individuals, heads of think tanks, board members, those who had think tank networks, those that were funders of think tanks. How do they determine success? How do they assess impact? And from that, had a set of criteria that were developed. at the end of it, I realized that this might be of tremendous value to think tanks. And so two things happened. One, I tested it in terms of looking at institutions and developed a list of the top think tanks in the world. What I did wrong in the first round of this was I provided an alphabetical list. And not since that moment have the howls of this is useless, why don't we want to know where we stand? And so the next year, started with the ranking based on, a numerical ranking across now 52 categories, 7,500 think tanks, 65,000 or 75,000 individual nominations. So it's
So is it a combination of a survey and analysis?
It's actually two things. One, it's peer and expert. So there are now 63,000 people on the listserv, so I can follow how many people have stayed on, who's dropped off. And then, as a part of that 62,000, 7,500 are think tanks, and we do due diligence every year to make sure that all of the think tanks in the world, that we have the proper contact and that they are aware of it. Doesn't always work, and I encourage anyone who is from a think tank to let us know who are the key contacts within their organization. And then it's journalists, policymakers, academics that are the peers, and then there's a set of experts within the community. So it's a peer and expert ranking. Once again, in the initial stages, second, third year, I went to experts first. What is their list of the top think tanks? People said I had it the wrong way. I should start with an open nomination process and go. And that was probably one of the best recommendations that is made. Each year we ask for
example of it's good to listen to your critics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And we've adjusted that, and it helps in big and small ways. Like this institution, this happened during the year, you really should reevaluate this. Or minor things like you have in the same institution in Spanish and in English. Mm-hmm. And those things have really helped tremendously in improving the independence and accuracy of the ranking.
Give us a look under the hood as far as this year's rankings. What are the things that have jumped out to you that might be surprising, or are there trend lines that you can identify?
Yeah, well, each year, in addition to the rankings itself, we try to point to what two things which are reflected in all of in addition to the rankings, the effort, which was a part of today's program here at the Wilson Center, is to bring the think tank community together, not only within the North America, but globally. And so we have summits of think tanks in all of the regions of the world. Part of the effort is to essentially, and in those, in the report, and in those summits are to look at two things. One, what are the policy challenges facing think tanks and policymakers in a region? And what are the institutional challenges that are facing, which once again, in terms of the political and digital disruptions, which was the subject of today's program, are the focus. This year, we have chosen to focus on two very important issues and identify. So part of it's researching the issue. The second part is identifying what are the institutions around the world that are working on it. So one of the issues is food and water security, which I believe will be, is a looming crisis that will require thinking, and we wanted to identify the key institutions around the world. Spent about 14 months researching the issue and identifying the institution. The second is, and partners here at the Wilson Center and Brookings were part of an effort to look at the sustainability crisis in Africa for African think tanks. 30% of African think tanks are likely to disappear in the next 3 to 5 years. I would suggest that in addition to that, there are another 20, 25% that are fragile and potentially failing. And so my fear, and in terms of all of this, I tend to try to be in terms of the trend analysis, looking at where do we need, what are the issues that we need to address, both policy-wise and institutionally, so that we're not in a place where there's a major crisis in Africa and 30, 40% of the institutions that were there are no longer there to help think through the crisis.
Beyond individual institutions or issues, in the last decade or so, probably you're on the short list of people who've thought most deeply about these things. So I want to ask you the big philosophical question in the ideas industry about where ideas come from and how they make their way into usage by public policy makers or NGOs or whoever might apply them. Just share with us some of your most important thoughts on that subject.
Well, I mean, I think the key part, and I think there's a part of what I'm, in terms of for think tanks around the world, we're at a very important transition point where the way of doing business, the way of recruiting the senior executive, the way of recruiting fundraisers, the way of recruiting the tech staff, the way of, in terms of the scholars that we recruit, are all going to change. And that the business models we have will have to change simply because the world has changed so radically and is so disruptive. And it is disrupting all sectors, and there's a lot we can learn from other sectors about that. Part of it, to answer your question directly, was addressed in the panel today in terms of institutions, and it's part of the purpose of the panel of helping provide some sense of how do we do this. And clearly the most fundamental change, I think, are points that I would make. One is that quality research and analysis will remain the central mission of think tanks. What has and will continue to change is how you package it and how you deliver it and to what audiences. And understanding those things, and those institutions that get it and have innovated and adapted, not given up on quality, those I think will quickly go away. But those that focus on quality and then think about innovative ways to deliver the content and to a range of audiences, is those that are the ones that are successful and will continue to be successful.
Do you think tanks live at the tip of the spear in combating what we call fake news or digital disinformation, or however you'd like to categorize that?
Well, I mean, I think I think it is, as I and others have pointed out today, the fake news, the alternative facts are things that create opportunities for think tanks. And some have pointed out today, which I totally agree with, the lack of consensus, the dysfunctional dimensions of government. Think tanks fill that void. And personally, in terms of now traveling abroad, the failure to provide clear sense in terms of policy, they're looking to institutions, think tanks, to provide that, certainly in the U.S. And one of the things that I didn't say this morning at the program is that one of the things we really need to do for think tanks is provide funding for them to go out as credible voices in a much more aggressive way, not only outside of Washington to the heartland of the U.S., but also abroad. That
chorus of amens you hear are people in the think tank industry.
Yeah.
Where can people who'd like to dig through the entire report get more information?
It'll be posted at the University of Pennsylvania's Scholarly Commons, so you can just simply go to www.upenn.edu. At the top of the page is a search, and you just put in 2017 Global Go-To. It will be available next week.
And before we let you go, when does the process begin for next year?
Today.
Today, it already began.
Unfortunately, yes. It's sort of, it's
keeping score during the panel.
Yeah, right. I mean, and sort of it, the next round is this very important process of what do we get right, what do we get wrong. Things like 5 or 6 years ago, social media prior to that wasn't on, and people said you really need to focus on that. So those are important changes that will take place with the input that we will get from think tanks that were here today. And what I haven't pointed out, that this program today took place in 175 hosts in over 100 cities around the world. The objective is to create a global community of think tanks, which was achieved today, and I'm very pleased with the success of this event and the events that have already taken place in many countries around the world.
More to come. I should tell the event that Jim has referenced several times, if you'd like to watch that in its entirety, you can find a link on the page where you're watching this video as well. Jim, thank you. Very useful. Keep us on our toes, and continued success.
Yeah, my pleasure.